Phylicia, welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Aiden.
Yeah, this is, I'm excited to do this. You've had a pretty extensive leadership career. You've been at Viva, Deloitte. Today, you're the Senior Director of Global Talent Development at PagerDuty. Actually, I am a big fan of PagerDuty. We use it here at Fellow, and so do many people in many companies across the world. So welcome. I wanted to start off by talking about mistakes, which is one thing that we often do here on this show. You've obviously led many teams over a pretty extensive period of time. So wanted to dial back and rewind to the beginning
Mm-hmm.
and ask you, when you first started out, what were some of the mistakes that you tended to make in leading teams?
Yeah, so I think making mistakes and thinking about your learnings as a leader is so important to a leader's growth. And one of the main mistakes I kept making over and over again earlier on, and really kind of finding my footing in leadership, was being too nice. And I know when you kind of hear that, it's that, sometimes as a manager, constantly trying to please people. You're trying to tailor and maybe lessen who you are to meet people almost like too much where they are, and you lose part of yourself in the process. So how that showed up for me is that I would filter down what I really meant, or I would be not okay initiating conflict or debate because I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings or didn't want to say the wrong things. But when you do that, you actually don't get to a better decision, or you don't actually get to a better idea because you're not saying what needs to be said in the room. And so I learned early on, like I would leave meetings or I would leave conversations not feeling like I brought my best self. Or I was almost like being too nice, where I'm like, did they understand what I was saying? And so after, part of my leadership journey and getting into not just leadership development and building inclusive leaders, but I've learned this idea of covering or code switching. You're constantly lessening who you are, your behaviors, to really make other people comfortable, but then you lose the ability to actually innovate or really get to the work that matters. So my team knows how I've grown from that is this role of name it. So naming it very clearly, what is going on, and like naming not only how you're feeling, your emotions, but like if there's an idea that's not going to work, why, right? And so it's almost like I think naming it also prompts being curious and really kind of think, how would you explore that? What should we consider? And one of the things people see in my consistency is this idea of, as a leader, having real talk, because we're real human beings creating real solutions that are about real problems that we have to solve for our teams, our customers, etc. And so when you really lean into that responsibility that you have to not aim to be nice, but get to a better outcome or improve an employee experience or ensure someone uncovers what's blocking them to improve. Like coaching requires you to actually have some candor and actually, because I care deeply, as Kim Scott says, you have to sometimes say the things that are hard to say out loud, but you care about that person. And so I made that transition of not being nice, but really building a relationship of human connection so that I could actually just say what needed to be said, knowing that's coming from a good place. So I'm obviously I'm a nice person, but when it comes to really solving some really tough and hard issues, sometimes I'm leaning all in and saying what sometimes it's hard to say out loud because we have to solve the hard things.
Yeah, no, there's so much to unpack there. So let's start with this. You use some terms, and I want to make sure that I understood the terms correctly. So did you say
Yeah.
covering and code switching?
Yes. Yeah. So they're kind of two in the same, but different. So in the inclusion, diversity, and equity world, we have people from marginalized communities who sometimes have to lessen who they are, their behaviors, identity, and show up, especially if they're the only in the room. And how that comes across is that sometimes they're not bringing 100% of themselves because they may be the only one. They don't want to have repercussions against them. And that means that they're not saying all the things, or they're being quiet, or they're not speaking up. And that can actually lessen that person's experience and not really think about that person belonging to the situation. And we don't want people to actually have that, especially if you're trying to build a place of belonging. We want people to actually bring their best self. And that sometimes that best self is 100% of who they are, that whole self that's human, both at home and work, that's now integrated. And so those are just like two different terms that we try to remove as part of the employee experience. And leaders have a critical role to ensure that people feel like they can be themselves when they're having a tough debate or making a hard decisions and not lessening their language to do so.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and that is that's very interesting. I was not familiar with those terms, and so, but do they essentially mean the same thing, or are they slightly different?
It depends on, usually code switching is usually coined for those who identify people of color, because in tech, we're trying to increase representation. So we tend to see code switching be more aligned to black and brown talent, because sometimes they're the only ones in the room. Recovery can show up across multiple identities, across LGBTQ plus community, black and brown community. It really depends, because the environment or culture, if the identities are not well represented, they won't bring that part of themselves to work, whether it's like someone will lessen their joy of possibly a game or a habit or a hobby, because maybe they think it's not something that's welcome to talk about at work, or sometimes because it's like close to mental health awareness during this time, beginning of October, sometimes people may not talk about the fact that they go to therapy, and they kind of cover that part of why they may need time off. So I think as we create more diverse and inclusive teams, these things are now becoming part of the conversation that we can no longer cover in the workplace.
Yeah, no, thank you for educating me on these words. I think
Yeah.
it's important, like you said, to be able to name it. And once you're able, there's something magical that happens when you name something because all of a sudden you can talk about it. One of the I know training is you live in the world of training, but one of the things that was really interesting for me, there was once upon a time, um, one of my last companies, we hired sales trainers and they came in, and obviously there was the usefulness of training your sales team, but
Mhm.
it also got us all to speak the same language, and we could refer to things and how to address things in a certain way. And I personally thought that the common language was the most useful part of that entire sales training. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, being able to name these different things that happen in the workplace is super valuable. So I have to ask you. So you found out that, I mean, you probably knew that you're a nice person, but how did you figure out that this was a mistake, if you will? Like, did someone tell you in a performance review, Felicia, you're way too nice, or how did that come about?
So one of my favorite managers, who is the reason why I lead the way I do today, her name is Chris Westall. There was a meeting I was having and with her, and she was asking for like my point of view. And I knew my point of view would probably disrupt her point of view or the CEO's point of view, because I just disagreed. But I didn't want to say it out loud because I knew that possibly she may not like it or the CEO wouldn't like it. So I just like kept it to myself. And one time in that meeting, she was like, "How come you don't have a point of view?" And I was like, "I don't think it matters, because I just think we're going to do whatever you and the CEOs think we should do." And she was like, "You always need to have a point of view, whether it is something that's going to disrupt an idea, or forget about thinking already before something even happens. Like, you're the person in charge that needs to actually bring that point of view to the table, and stop worrying about what people are thinking. You have to own up to your point of view." She's like, "Always have a point of view." And she didn't specifically give me that advice on being nice. It was just holding back maybe something that could have disrupted a conversation, and I just didn't want to. I wanted to keep the peace. I didn't want to. But when she like really planted that seed, I had to then lean in to figure out like what kind of voice did I want to have in the room when people way above my authority were in the room. And she reminds me that like, you're the only one in this role who's passionate about this work. And so if you don't have a point of view, then like your passion's not going to be seen through with other people. And so once I got comfortable with my voice, whether it was like maybe making people uncomfortable of like what I'm kind of going off track, or a new idea that maybe we haven't considered, the more that I was able to explore the possibility of getting to a better outcome with brainstorming or collaborating on an idea. And I just recently read about this book called The CEO Next Door. And one of the things and advice is there that CEOs shouldn't need to be nice, because they sometimes will blur their vision, or that will blur the opportunity to actually really get your team and company focus on the work that matters. So you have to think about like what's necessary for your product or your customer and that element. And like when I heard that, I was like, that's what I was doing early on in my career. I was trying to constantly, make sure I was being nice and keep the peace. But sometimes you got to be disruptive to innovate. And so that moment always sticks out to me, is that, and I share that with my team, is that you have always think and remember, I'm going to ask you for your point of view, because when you share that, we put our point of views together and we get to a better idea or outcome. And so, yeah, and I think that's just like a key sticking point when I think about my growth, is being comfortable with my voice and being a little bit disruptive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so the book you referenced was The CEO Next Door.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And so is there I mean, this is a very interesting point. I think like over the many generations, we humans have learned that it's important to be liked, because, back in the day, if there was this, tribe and you weren't liked and you were, you're basically not taken care of, then the tigers might eat you, and that's probably not a good thing. So it's been built into us to want people to like us, and so we tend to not to want to disrupt things. My question is there a time where, like, when to hold back, or should you just have an opinion on everything and disrupt? Like, how do you know when it's worth it and when it's not? Like, when do you disagree and commit, and when do you not?
Yeah, and one of the things I think of a leader, it's like the greatest gift, but it's also the hardest challenge sometimes. And one of the things that I've been learning about, reading about, and teach about is this idea that leaders must be present in the spaces that they're in, the spaces that they hold, the spaces they create, because without that, you miss, as once I heard, it's like you miss the elephants and the small little ants that are rolling by at the same time. And when I think about that, it's just really important to, I just like lost my train of thought, actually. What was I going to say is, Amy, can you ask your question again? I got jumped up with the elephant and the ants. What was your question again?
Yeah, no worries. So my question is, in terms
yes,
of,
I remember.
okay,
I remember now, right now. Like, how do you know when to hold back and when to lean in, type of thing?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Now that's what. So I was mentioning about like being present in those moments, because I think you have to read the room. And when you're present, you can observe like who's not talking and who is talking. You can call people in and call people out. You can create space, make space. And I think that presence is really important, because I always think about this acronym that I always teach is like WAIT, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? Because if the leader is going to include their team on ideas, ideation, you have to think about, how am I calling them in? And I sometimes start a lot of conversations with setting context, but also asking questions. And I allow everyone a chance to answer that question. I never really try to come in with all the answers, because that can also kind of disrupt the collaborative process. So I think it's one of the things where you have to just build a habit to pause, wait, and use questions. So then you don't find yourself as a leader filling up all the airtime and trying to think you have all the ideas. And the reason why I say that is because after my consulting career, I went directly into tech. And some of the first amount of feedback I received was, PJ, you're very intense. And I was like, how? Well, how am I intense? And like,
that's the opposite of nice.
This is nice. And so exactly, and it was like, you always come to a meeting with like fully baked agendas. You always have these already formatted, finalized slides. We never know if you want our opinion, if we can add to the agenda. We don't know what you want from us, but we want to collaborate with you. But it sounds like you already have all your ideas. I'm like, oh, so being intense is also associated with like being overly structured. And like, almost not creating space for people to actually share their ideas. And as a consultant, you have to come in with all that structure sometimes when you think about that's what you're getting paid for by the hour. And I had to kind of switch my mindset around. Tech is a collaborative environment. And sometimes you, even if you think you have all the answers, you still want to create a space where people can have a say, or you can hear their voice, and you can help that inform a decision that maybe you're the owner of, but you can still get their voice before you make that decision to move forward. So I think I switched my mindset, and all leaders should do this, is that you don't have to be the one with all the answers. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. When you can create space where you value your team's point of view, you can co-create solutions, like there's going to be more buy-in, more engagement as an outcome. And I've been in situations where the leader wanted to have all the answers, and you just sat there quietly and just looked and stared and like, oh, guess we're getting lectured to, right? And so I know the feeling of what it feels like not to have a voice, and I also know the feeling of when I've allowed my team to have a voice, and there's just like more engagement. So I think the more, and I love to talk, and so the more that I just wait and call people in and set that agreement that I'm going to ask your point of view, I'm going to ask for your ideas, I'm going to ask you to actually disagree with me. And like when you give them that permission, I do think that signals to you as their team and you that, oh yeah, I agree that I'm going to ask them for their opinion. And so let me just stop talking. Right. So I think that's how I would say is like when you know when to lean in and when you don't. And I think you have to be super present to know when to do either of those things.
You know, the way that you describe when you say, I certainly know that I've been across the table where I felt like I've been lectured to, just that way of phrasing it made me realize how many times I've made this mistake myself. So I'm like, thank you for highlighting it in those words specifically. For that resonated with me more in a way more than any other way that I've heard the listen first and speak last type
Yes.
advice. But
Yeah.
that is incredibly valuable. So that makes a lot of sense. It's so interesting that some things that some people might consider an advantage, and it is an advantage, being structured and being ready and prepared, can actually have downsides. What a crazy concept. But also, it's so interesting. I remember we had this another guest on this show, and she was saying that she once got feedback that she walked really fast in between meeting rooms, from meeting room to meeting room, and she always seemed so rushed to go from one to the other that people would be afraid to go up to her because she was too busy. But it's like a
Wow.
different version of the same sort of thing that you're talking about. If you have an agenda prepared and but creating space, no, that's incredible advice.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that is when you think about building culture, they talk about cues and behaviors. And, this idea of like your words and action must be really consistent. And otherwise, and you don't like name those out loud, then the stories that your team builds about you, like the ladder of perception, is that they'll see one event and they'll start to make conclusions, they'll start to make actions, they'll start to make value statements just based on you doing something that you didn't think people were looking at you. So not only do I tell our leaders when I coach them is that you have to be super present in those conversations, but also I tell them like your team is evaluating you every minute, every second. They're looking at what you do, what you say, and even in between, you're not doing and saying anything. And that sends a signal of how the standard of the team or what the team talks about and what the team does. And so I'm constantly aware that everything I do is a cue. And so I always tell people the talent development person never gets a day off, right? Like we have to be the leader who's setting the example for all leaders in the organization.
Yeah, this is this is why this stuff is very hard. There's no defined playbook. So my question is, I did want to talk about talent development and also learning. So you've described your position at PagerDuty is basically to rethink, invest, and develop systems, people, and processes help employees experience career making moments. What does that mean, like a career making moment?
Yeah, I think when I think about leadership, I mean, learning and development or talent development, they're all go hands in hand. There's this concept of employee experience, right? And people are having a journey across these different, what I like to call like milestones, but also how they show up as like these moments and moves, right? And these are either transitions or transformations that one's having, either when they're a new hire, building their career, or also trying to think about like, where do I go next within the organization? And what my team focuses on is those moments and moves, is making sure that we may not be in that one-on-one with their manager, but is there some training and coaching or prompting that manager to bring into those one-on-ones to have a really great conversation? They come to our manager fundamental trainings to actually learn how to create that safe space to have really meaningful conversations. Or it's like, where do I focus in my first day one, week one, or day 30 when I'm onboarding? And my team helps to prioritize all the noise that you get in your first day, week one, as we deliver the Tony experience. And then the Tony experience actually walks through and connects that new hire to people, our company, our customers, and our product. Very streamlining like what they need to focus on as they learn how to navigate PagerDuty. And then I think about another process and system is the infamous performance reviews, right? And that really is like the sums up the entire year. We have to think about really meaningful goal setting, really targeted, career conversations, and really making sure that all can be summarized throughout the year through quarterly check-ins and then the year-end conversation. And a lot of times we're providing those tools and prompters to do that. So, those are just some examples where we look at the across the employee experience, and we know the questions that are going through the manager's brain, what's going through the employee brain throughout that employee experience. It's like, how do we start to make those moments easy? How do we make them more meaningful? How do we ensure that someone's moving through those transition points without it being super complicated, right? Because when those things happen, like, I don't believe like learning agility and career development should be hard. But when it's the system's all over the place, or there's no clear system, or the system's not equitable or inclusive, then we have to look at that to make sure anyone who's trying to have a career can do it here at PagerDuty. Otherwise, in the great resignation, they can go somewhere else to do it, right? And we know that our key investments in diversity, equity, and inclusion, we know that belonging, all of our systems have to be equitable, right? So it's a lot of hard work in talent development to ensure that our systems and our programs are constantly having that reach and accessibility across the employee experience. And so we measure it very closely to make sure we're prompting those behaviors or getting to those outcomes. If not, we're changing it up. And so we may iterate every year, every 6 months, based on the participation rate, the engagement, the net promoter score, simply to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our employees.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So but it's very interesting the way you put it, which is ultimately it's about the systems and also making sure that you don't leave it up to chance. Like there is a defined set of systems, procedures, prompts, and even iteration is baked into the way that you do things.
Yeah.
So let's talk about something which is which I found very interesting, which is something that you created called a learning week.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. So, usually talent development functions start small, one person. And so I used to do learning duty, which was me roaming around different offices and delivering training and whatnot. That's not scalable. And so we then had to look at like, well, what are those critical skills and behaviors that are important for our scale or important part of our employee experience? And so we then designated a targeted week in the quarter where learners, Daytonians, leaders could rely on getting their learning. Because we had got feedback from employees like, I don't even know when training is being available, right? Like I find out last minute. So we usually communicate our learning weeks every year in advance. They know when they're happening each quarter. And we focus on like delivering 2 sets of series as part of that. So we have a first series that's focused on moments that matter. So going back to my moments theme, and in that, key moments we have a course on career ownership. We have another course on communicating in a team setting and for collaboration. And the third course as part of that series is focused on feedback, which we know is just so critical when I think about teams performing well, is just having a really good flow of feedback for accountability. And then our second series is focused on what we call like no limits. It's really thinking about innovation. So as part of that, there's 4 different courses that are linked to like creative leadership, design thinking, positive risk taking, and then how to influence others around your ideas. So those are just core topics that we deliver. Actually, Learning Week is next week that we're delivering. So people can look forward to taking all in the entire series, or just take have options to take 1 or 2 of the courses that are pertinent to what they're trying to focus on for that quarter. So that's kind of Learning Week, and it's more just focused and giving the learner a chance to spend 2 hours a week or take all the sessions to learn with their peers and create those connection points. Because I think learning is now a great opportunity to create casual collisions and our breakouts and practice sessions that come with those different learning experiences.
Got it. So you have so these are all courses that you've developed internally, or do you also work with external parties for this?
So these are courses. So, I love building content. I love reading. So a lot of my inspiration comes from my own experiences. Actually, part of Deloitte is where I developed my love for training development. So I'm an instructor designer as well. So I built all these courses myself. And
Wow.
so, yeah, so I tell people if there's any topic, I could probably build content around it. But we have evolved this. So we do offer pre and post reinforcements. And I have worked with a vendor called Curious Line who helps build some pre-session videos and post-session videos to support the bookends of the experience. So they just really take my content and sum it up in a video that's no longer than 5 minutes. But yeah, I mean, during March of last year, I was building content for manager fundamentals training, and I built all 5 modules, which I can't believe it now thinking about it, but that did happen. And it's just some deep thinking time to innovate in the learning space.
That's amazing. So you have this content, and so is the idea of Learning Week? It sounds like it's a thing that happens once a quarter.
Mhm.
So that is the time. So that it's interesting. So the problem that you were trying to solve was nobody told me about the training, and like when do I take it? Give people like allow people to anticipate when it's coming, so they can plan around it. It all happens during a time, and it's like a sprint because you do it, and then I guess like you have time to get feedback, make it better, prepare for the next one. That's a really good cadence, and I can see why you would structure it that way. It's one of those things that sounds good, but it's not obvious.
Yes.
But now that you've mentioned it, that makes a lot of sense to me. So
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Mhm.
So what about like asynchronous in general? I'm curious, like how some of these have evolved, because again, I assume you have employees all over the world, different time zones.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. So think about like one, you talked about like, oh, you can constantly iterate. Yes. So I mentioned, me developing content for our management fundamentals. We call it Green Shield. It's really our first level of learning for managers. And I developed it for a virtual live session. So it had a chance to actually bring people together. It's a series, it's 5 modules, 2 hours each. We have since iterated that. So now it's actually 1 hour per module. 30 minutes of it is actually a e-learning async where you're just getting the frameworks. You have a little action planning guide. It's all through our LMS. And there's some videos and interactive, knowledge checks in there. And then to still drive the peer-to-peer connection and practice, we do have facilitators, which is our HR business partners who hold practice sessions. So one of our topics is team enablement, and they do some scenario practice of what's a horrible onboarding experience and how do you make it better, or how to practice some of those initial one-on-one conversations you would have with your new hire that you're just onboarded as a manager. So they have a chance to practice those conversations and think through innovative onboarding improvements they would make by onboarding someone remotely. So they have a chance to practice that in an hour setting with their fellow peers who have also just completed the online version of it. So we have tried to really make that accessible, not only in the US time zone and the Canada time zone, but now with the asynchronous view, we can make sure anyone promoted or hired as a manager in EMEA or in our Australia and Sydney office, that they can also take that training within their first 3 days as a manager. So we're probably going to eventually make it completely all e-learning and focus some of our efforts for the live sessions that we do that really need that high impact not in person, I should say virtual connection with a executive coach or myself that are some key scaling behaviors. But we have actually moved to async for not only our Green Shield, but also some of our Moments That Matter series.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So but just so that I have it correctly, the practice where you practice onboarding someone,
Mhm.
that part is not asynchronous, right?
Correct. And so, one of the concepts I like to bring into the learning space and just kind of, I think about learning as an experience, right? And there are just some topics that are just not great delivered asynchronously, right? I think everything from a behavior or skill must be practiced to make it sticky, to you know how to in a safe environment, so you know how to actually apply it when you're back on the job. And so what we have done is more of a blended approach. And so, if I think about manager enablement, a lot of that is like tough, just in time, high stakes decisions you have to make as a leader. And you're not getting that interaction, that response, that reinforcement sometimes in a e-learning course. And so we bring in the peer practice because it just helps reinforce. Also, you can share lessons learned with your peer managers who are in different function who may be operating this way. So you actually get multiple perspectives at the same time by bringing other managers together who are also new to the organization, and the HR business partner to provide additional context for some of those situations that happen within a department or function.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like the blended approach makes a lot of sense. And so while asynchronous does solve a lot of things, it is not the end all be all solution for everything. So
Mhm.
that I think makes a lot of sense. The one of the things that I wanted to chat with you about is data. So you work in a pretty large organization. And so we talked about iterating on some of the training development modules and things that you've created. But how else do you use data for measuring how things are going?
Yeah, at PagerDuty, we actually love data. Our platform is baked with data. So we can actually understand how our customers are thinking about real-time response for their solutions. And so it's naturally that we measure every moment and that matters within the organization. So we do an engagement survey, we do wellness surveys, we also do an inclusion survey. So we've thought about maybe survey fatigue a little bit. But it's important for us to have a pulse on how our folks are feeling, especially when the office is not a place where we can kind of do that check in and see what's happening around us. And so, in general, when it comes to data, and we do a lot of intervention and action planning post those surveys going out. And, just going back to the leader in that element is you're getting this data. And we really teach managers to own that. So, one, we when we do surveys, it sends a cue to the population that like we want to understand how you feel. And the worst thing we can do is not respond, not recognize, not say thank you for participating. We're now going to take your feedback and take some action on it. And so each leader does get a pull from their results from the department, those who have big enough teams, and they have that data. Now, data to me is one, it's a point in time and it tells one story. And I think what those great leaders are doing is they're getting the insights by taking their top three, bottom three to their team and having a conversation. And so I think holistically, how I like to think about data is like, yes, you need to collect data, not only to measure programs, but to measure engagement. And where do you focus your attention as a leader? Because you could be doing some really great things, right? But there's blind spots that happen and you want to understand and cover your blind spots. And so I always say, like, know your bottom three and get context, right? Get more context by having a conversation of like, hey, team, why may we have scored low on this? Like, can you give me some ideas how we improve this? How can we make a team agreement? How can we make a rule of engagement for how we move past this? And sometimes those are the conversations or the insights that actually provide additional narrative or additional storytelling to the data that's sitting out there in those inclusion surveys or engagement surveys. So I like to think about data. You can't take it too personally, but you are asking your team to complete surveys. And it's important that we recognize that people are taking time. And we hear and we see them. But I think when you can have a conversation with your team to go alongside that data that you're seeing, I think you're driving more engagement. So like, for example, my team is pretty small. We're a very lean, mighty talent development team. And I don't typically get results just on my team. I get a roll up. And so one of my roles that I tell my team is, if you're waiting for the engagement survey or inclusion survey to tell me how something can be improved, like ask yourself why you're waiting for that survey to come out. Instead, find the courage to tell me in a one-on-one what I can do today to help improve your employee experience today. Like, don't have me wait. And I actually, one of my roles is I have a lot of roles, I guess, is no surprises, right? And so that's one of our team agreements. So lean into that courage to tell me, because I don't want to find out on the inclusion survey or the engagement survey. I want to address it right now if we can solve it right now. So a lot of times I try to get that insight by gathering data every week from my team, whether it be in our team meetings or in one-on-ones, to know how I'm doing as a leader to stay engaged, to make sure I'm keeping things relevant, exciting, and aligning work to their passion so that I'm not waiting for the results from the engagement survey.
That makes a lot of sense. I like the term "no surprises." That I would agree. Like, if you're doing a really good job as a leader, then there should be no surprises. Of course, there will never be no surprises, but we can definitely, it can be something that we aim for.
Mm-hmm.
I guess a question I have, and maybe this is a tactical one. With the number of surveys that you're running, yes, survey fatigue. I used to work at SurveyMonkey at some point, and so um, lived in the survey world for quite a while. My question is, what is your expectation around how many people within the company fill out a survey? Ideally, it's 100%. Most of the time, these things don't get everybody to fill them out. So, what would you consider success? For
Yeah.
for that number of surveys?
We always try to make sure we improve the participation rate each time we do it. So usually for an engagement and inclusion survey, we're trying to get above 90%.
Oh, that's pretty high.
Right. Yeah, because only if you think about, like, 10% are probably new to the company. So may not have the full-on experience to actually give really good a kind of a score to a certain factor or rating area. So we try to always aim for that. Since I've been here, we've actually gotten between 80 and 90%. But we know if a low participated survey, like, we kind of have to think about what's the value, what are we getting out of that survey when only half the company completed it, right? We're almost excluding some perspectives, right? And so with our huge push on inclusion and also making sure we're coming up with equitable solutions, we have to drive for that above 90% completion rate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think we've covered a lot of topics today. We've started with talking about how you are a nice person, but you're also very structured. We talked about creating space and feedback, learning, data, all across the board. So many insights. One of the questions that we like to leave all of our guests with is, for all the managers and leaders constantly looking to get better at their craft, what tips, tricks, or maybe parting words of wisdom would you leave them with?
Yeah, okay, I have a couple of things I could kind of think about that would, tell a manager out there who's trying to always improve is, one is, like, focus on developing yourself. Is, I think, the world's changing every day. And that means, like, who we bring into organizations, into our teams, they're also going through the changes as well. And so how we thought we needed to lead 20 years ago, 50 years ago, it's changed, that even in the last 2 years. And so I always think about, you have to build a learning approach for yourself, how you're going to stay attuned to just not only the industry you're in, but like how you want to lead, because you need followers to be a leader, right? People have to really follow you, especially when there's challenges. And a lot of the time that becomes is like, how are you going to be vulnerable? How are you going to share what you're working on? How are you going to create space for other people to want to actually jump in the boat with you around a challenge? And so a lot of times it's like, if you can actually always focus on how you're growing as a leader. And one of the things I do is try to read all the books. I read a lot of books to help also inform my perspective on when I coach and when I teach. but also share those learnings and teaching with my team. And that gives them a cue that you also can learn and develop as well. So I just really encourage people to constantly learn new things as a leader, because we have to be adaptable as we move through this world. Second thing, I think with the growth of just moving organizations to be more a sense of belonging, I think being culturally competent and having inclusive leadership language and behaviors is so key if you want to have representation, a diverse team, being able to attract diverse talent. You have to be seen as an active ally at the top. And so if you're not on your inclusion, diversity, or equity journey as a leader, start getting on it now. One book I recommend leaders read to kind of start their journey and get some perspective is a book called The Wake Up that was just released last week by Michelle Mei-Jung Kim. And, she is, sharing her perspective on, teaching leaders how to be inclusive, and really good examples that she calls out in that book. And then lastly, I would say is, oh gosh, is that going to be in the, sorry, I just realized that sound. Did you hear that sound?
No.
Oh, you didn't hear sound? Okay.
No.
So you may have to cut that out, but
yeah, we'll cut that out.
Okay. Is there's that saying of put your kind of like oxygen mask on first before you put your, mask on your child when you're on the airplane. I think it is hard to be a leader. And so if leaders have not built a habit on how to think about their own self-care, how to kind of like take care of themselves and then come back better, you have to build that routine into your work, into your schedule, into maybe putting deep thinking time on your calendar, and let your team see that. Take PTO and don't work on your PTO, because that actually creates really good just norms and boundaries as a leader. And it gives a signal that people don't dread being a leader. They're saying like, oh, actually I had a manager who learned how to create space for themselves, and they were always present during the team because they took care of themselves. And I think if we don't really appreciate the grind that comes with leadership, it will grind you down. And I really think leaders have to find a way to take care of themselves. Otherwise, it's going to have a reflection on your team. It's going to show up in your team energy and your team environment. So take care of yourself as leaders.
That's great advice and a great place to end it. Phylicia, thank you so much for doing this.
Welcome. Thank you.